There's a wonderful quote from the Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, who says, outside his field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy.
That right there is probably one of the most important things he could have said in this video that went right over his head and John Anderson's head. Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Kay, the devout atheist, and today I'm planning to tackle a video I watched recently between John Anderson and Professor John Lennox. Some of you might be familiar with me and the work I do with Tesla's FSD in the customer space, and if you're joining me from having been a fan of that channel and following, I really appreciate it. I hope that you find value in this. My purpose here with this channel is to step into the ring of intellectual discourse and to be a communicator of science and critical thinking in a world that definitely seems starved of these concepts. With that, I will say that I am familiar with Professor Lennox. I've seen his 2 debates with Richard Dawkins, as well as his debate with Christopher Hitchens, a personal hero of mine. I think the world could definitely do to have more like him, a master wordsmith and a communicator of ideas in the face of a very domineering presence that is modern theology. That being said, my plan is not to be one of those people that is just attacking theists and believers, but rather to attack the arguments, to actually examine what's being said. And as an example, we're going to be going over today the logic of Christianity with John Lennox and John Anderson on a video of which the link will be in the description on the YouTube channel and in the description of, the tweet. I'm planning to do this on both Twitter and YouTube with the Devout Atheist channel. And I, of course, want to make sure I link all the content that I am reviewing in the description so you can see it in its entirety. This is about 50 minutes long, and we're going to focus on the key points that I think are really worth going into. Most of the beginning, pleasantries and introductions, and talking about Professor Lennox's experience with C.S. Lewis, a renowned apologist in the Christian atmosphere, as well as the author of the Narnia books. And Professor Lennox has been influenced by C.S. Lewis from a very young age, as early as 13, I believe he says in this video. And you can see from a very early point in his life, the Christian worldview has been very substantial in the way Professor Lennox approaches the world, even being a professor of mathematics and a philosopher of science. Now, as we go into some of the points that are brought up in this video, and some of the things that I know from having listened to Lennox speak in the past, in 2007 as well as 2009, granted, well over a decade ago, a lot of his views and his analogies have stayed pretty much the same. And I may seem harsh, I may seem a little hypercritical of some of the things, but that is very intentional, and not to attack John Lennox, but to really highlight how bad these arguments are, even with somebody who is as renowned in the Christian apologetics field or atmosphere as he is. Full disclosure, I myself am an atheist, a skeptical mind, and I have been for 15, 20 years. I was brought up in a very fundamentalist Christian faith known as Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I've always had a curious mind that has always been asking the why questions when it came to anything, especially from a young age. So I definitely did my share of irritating pastors and fellow church members. And putting that aside, we're going to go ahead and go into this video that clocks in actually at 48 minutes and 53 seconds, and we're going to pick out certain points to focus in on those arguments to give them the attention they need. I also invite any feedback you can give me on ways to make this better. I am working with what I have, and this is definitely my first attempt at doing something like this. It's very different from what I normally do in the FSD space. Links to all that will also be included wherever applicable via Twitter or YouTube.
His major contribution to my thinking, which is very active today, was his unpacking and deconstruction of naturalistic philosophy. And he showed me very clearly, because of his deep grasp of the philosophy of science, which is one reason many scientists don't like him. He understood exactly what was going on, that he could see that naturalism undermined not only science, but rationality itself. And that is a central argument even today, in my view.
Okay, so this is a pretty big starter already. To say that naturalism undermines science and rationality, and that it's a central point in his view, highlights initially a very big issue. This statement is contradictory, or a non sequitur, depending on how you look at it. The conclusion does not follow from the premises, because the naturalism or a naturalistic worldview is in effect a worldview without anything supernatural. It's, no magic, no deities, no need for these extra complex supernatural things when you have a natural way to study what's around you via the scientific method. Now, unfortunately, having watched Lennox quite a few times, this is a very recurring theme. He has this issue of his Christianity and science being able to reconcile and describe the world around us, as well as this repeated view that in order to do science, you have to assume rational intelligibility in the universe, essentially to presuppose a creative mind or an agent. He will often try to discern the difference between agency and mechanical understanding of what's around you. He does this in a way to bridge the gaps of our knowledge, sort of sugarcoating the God of the gaps idea in a lot of ways. And it's something that happens when you have somebody who does have an understanding of science to a degree, and then they try to reconcile it with their doctrine, with their religious dogma that does not have any scientific credence. And I would love to discuss that with anybody who disagrees down in the comments below, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, whatever. And I'm going to try not to digress too much and stay on topic and get more into the video, but I have a lot of knowledge and passion in this, and when it comes to comments like this that are so fundamentally flawed right off the get-go, I think it bears a lot of importance to highlight that issue.
Now, that is extremely interesting. Can we just explore that for a moment? Many people would be surprised to learn, and I'm convinced by this case, but others might not, that Christianity had a major and positive role to play in the development of science itself.
Yes, absolutely.
But the popular line now, of course, is that science and Christianity are somehow at war with one another, incompatible. And yet science, in many ways, is a product of a Christian worldview that says there's a God out there who did things and does things in an ordered way. We therefore have an opportunity to go and understand that order and to explore creation, to put it that way. But that's completely washed out of the narrative today.
Yes, it is. And ignorance of history is a very dangerous thing, as you know. It's sad, but Lewis pointed it out very clearly, and he was actually stating a thesis which is commonly accepted by leading historians of science, and they're the important people here. And Lewis's summary is memorable. It is this: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And he was really summarizing the work of the philosopher and historian Sir Alfred North Whitehead. But today, that thesis is widely represented. You have a very famous representative of it in Australia, and not only in Edwin Judge, the distinguished historian, but in the younger Peter Harrison, who's a distinguished Australian professor. And he adds to it, very interestingly, that it wasn't only the Judeo-Christian worldview believing in an intelligent creator and the rationality of the universe, but Peter Harrison actually goes further. And he says that a great contribution was made by the reformers' attitude to Scripture, going to Scripture not with ideas of allegory or what it should tell us, but rather to see exactly what it said. And Kepler did the same with the universe. Let's see what it says. And that changed the face of science for all time. So there's a very close connection. There are various nuances, of course, but I find it one of the strong evidences for Christianity. And I often put it this way, John. I say to people, look, I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject.
Okay, so we have a lot to unpack here, and I wanted to allow that full statement to play out because it's all around the same central thesis, so to speak, that, again, Lennox views the universe as rationally intelligible because it had a designer. It's another form of the argument from design, that because things around us appear designed, they must have a designer. Sometimes you've heard this reference as the blind watchmaker, or in some other veins, arguments from irreducible complexity, where you get to a certain point to where you can't go any further and it had to have been designed by something. Or the thinking that we know that cars and computers and phones and everything else is designed and has a blueprint and was made by an intelligent mind, so therefore this complex universe around us must also have an intelligent mind. These are conflations and issues with equivocation, not understanding the difference between causation and correlation, or the fact that just because something seems to be the case doesn't make it the case. But to get back to this point specifically, these gentlemen are discussing initially that science came from religion, and that because of this, there's some de facto responsibility to adhere to religion's dogma. At least that's how I would take that. That science came from an era in which pretty much everybody on Earth was religious bears little weight when you're trying to make it sound like science wouldn't exist without religion. It doesn't matter, or rather, I would say it's irrelevant that the majority of the population was religious in some sense or another, because at the time, most people were. We didn't know any better. When it comes to pointing out the fact that these scientists of this era were religious, it would be as relevant as making a comment that they're human. Let's look at these two statements, and maybe this will help you understand what I'm saying. As John said, science is a product of a Christian worldview and came from people who were religious. Okay, well, let's take that and change the words around a little bit. Science came from humans, and all these scientists were human. Yeah, what's the point? Now, that is a very, very simplified way of looking at what I identify as being the issue there. Just because everybody was something at a point in time when something emerged doesn't irreversibly tie that thing to that other thing. Science was birthed out of a curiosity to understand the world around us, dating back to the ancient Greeks and likely before that. All the way back to the start of the curious mind. You know, what makes it rain? What causes an eclipse? What is behind the makeup of fire and water? What are the fundamental elements, of which we used to think was just earth, wind, water, and fire? There seems to be this unfounded mentality of ownership over science from the religious space when it comes to these sorts of statements, because the very science they want to claim ownership of is not doing them any favors in highlighting some magical creation or supernatural or divine explanation for the world around us. The more we learn, the smaller and smaller the pocket of ignorance we have gets, and thus the smaller and smaller the gap remains for God to find his place in the areas of which we're at the edge of our understanding. An example being abiogenesis, or origin of life research, where you go from chemical to biological, as well as what happened before the Big Bang. We can get very, very, very close to the very beginning, but there comes a point where our knowledge ends, and we have to say, as responsible skeptics, I don't know. But that doesn't therefore mean something magical did it. I like to approach this topic now with the same mindset you would have around good engineering, the idea of first principles. In essence, the best part of process is no part or process. Keep it simple. Why add complexity when everything works just fine without that added complexity? And the idea that now science and religion are at war with one another is pretty grotesquely misplaced when you consider the fact that most scientists, frankly, don't care. They are too busy actually solving problems, asking the big questions, doing experiments, and studying the world around them to find these answers, to have any of their energy or brain power going towards the question of whether or not there was a supernatural start to the universe, or whether or not these 1,000 different religions have any credence to them. It's irrelevant. They don't care. They're not wasting their time with it. So this idea that there's this like war going on between science and religion is in fact inaccurately describing what's actually happening, which are skeptics challenging religious doctrine and dogma and bringing these conversations forward, like myself and so many great creators are, pun intended, to highlight the need for critical thinking, for analysis of these claims. Because when you put a religion on a pedestal to which you are trying to use it to explain phenomena around you, to explain the world around you, you are now making scientific claims, and thus you are going to be held to the same level of scrutiny. That's why you would have the saying coming from Carl Sagan that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Far be it from some war or some dark battle back and forth between the forces of good and evil. No, this is a matter of intellectual discourse. This is a matter of holding things to the same standard when it comes to claim, experiment, and finding out what is true. So the segment that we just watched also goes into a statement that I already brought up coming from Lennox's worldview, that the universe has to be rationally intelligible, and presupposes this argument from design, from some creator, for us to even be able to go out there and observe what's going on and understand the world around us. Now, I'd be happy to explain the issues with the argument from design, even getting into cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments. There's a lot of arguments presented around this. Nothing new. These are the same arguments that have been around for decades. Honestly, apologists, theists, and such, they have not been able to bring anything new to the table really worth breaking the mold. So we're sort of just going over the same things over the years. But these are the same things that people still believe, so they are worth discussing. However, breaking down the entire argument from design right now would take far too much time. So I'll address what I can in relation to this video. I have a feeling I'm probably gonna have to do this in like 2 parts, maybe 3, given how much I have talked with only the first 7 minutes of the video, so I do apologize. So after this, Lennox then says that, ignorance of history is a big problem, and mentions that historians of science are the actual important people here to be talking about, and that just harkens back to the need to bring science back to religion, to not accept the fact that it may have came from the religious curiosity initially, wondering what's going on, from gods to natural processes. But essentially what's happened here is we're beginning to know better. You know, we're starting to realize where we were incorrect and understand and break things down. And I say starting to, because if you look at timescales, you know, outside of what humans are normally experiencing and look at us from, you know, a special level, the last couple hundred years of skepticism is a very brief window in the overall amount of time that humans have been asking these questions or believing in deities. But as I called out ahead of time, Lennox does hold to the idea that we could not be observing this universe, this world around us, in a grand scale or a small scale without there being a rational mind behind its creation. And they like to leverage a lot of the language, the religious language used from early scientists to lend credence to this idea, when in fact it's through the scientific processes that we've been able to actually find out, like, no, this has a natural cause. Well, what about this? Oh, this does too. And you'll often find in these discussions that when we point out that we've made breakthroughs and figured out how something works, they'll continue to shift that goalpost further and further and back until we get to a point to where there is an I don't know portion to then again bring up, there you go, must be a creator. And however they like to sugarcoat this is fallacious reasoning centered around the god of the gaps, or the gaps in our knowledge being where magic lies, because we don't know what it is, therefore it had to be this thing. And the problem with that is it's very irresponsible. It's much better to say, I don't know, than to make up a story, because you lack the ability to understand, or you're that uncomfortable in ignorance. Scientists constantly live at the threshold of ignorance, between the barrier of what we know and what we don't know. And people who think like that are okay with that. That's part of the fun, the mystery, the appeal of discovery. But we will not get to a point where we don't know what happened and then go, oh, God did it, or anything else you want to fill in the gaps with. Now, there are weaker theories and stronger theories, but that's typically hedged against language around saying we aren't sure or don't know. We think it might be this thing or that thing, but we don't claim knowledge that it is some divine thing with which we also know the mind of that thing and can judge the world around us and the people around us based on the dogma from that thing. Hopefully the disconnect or the cognitive dissonance in a lot of this starts to come to light as I explain it.
The mathematician David Belinsky has written a book called, I think...
He has.
Yeah, I think the title's a play on Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, and I think Belinsky, even though he's an agnostic himself, not a believer, called his The Atheist Delusion. Now, presumably he, like Lewis, faced massive opposition, or faces opposition to this perspective from scientists, and yet the reality is that surely we need to accept science cannot answer all questions. And perhaps we need to remember that scientists can be human too. They're human, they can make mistakes, they don't get everything right. None of us do.
There's a wonderful quote from the Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman, who says outside his field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy.
All right, here we go. This is really important. A few things here. The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, fantastic book, highly recommend. I haven't read The Atheist Delusion, so I need to put that on my list and read that as well. I like exposing myself to both sides, because if you don't know the opposing side's mentality or arguments, then you're not really getting anywhere. On that note, I want to take this chance in this video to clear up something, and that's around the definition of an agnostic. So a lot of times people will incorrectly apply the term agnostic to mean 50-50, or I'm not sure, maybe, maybe not. That is not the case. Gnosticism is a claim to knowledge. You can be Gnostic about a process. You can be Gnostic that water freezes at 0 Celsius. You can be agnostic or not know about many things as well. There's a difference between a belief or lack of a belief and a claim to knowledge. Now, anybody, theist and atheist alike, that is intellectually honest will admit to being agnostic to the actual existence of God. The difference being that an agnostic theist can never be sure to actually know, but they believe. You know, that's part of faith and religion, to believe that there is a supernatural deity there. Whereas on the atheist side, you would have an agnostic atheist that doesn't know, but isn't convinced by any of the evidence set forth to believe in the God hypothesis. That being said, atheism is not a belief system. You wouldn't apply the same way of thinking when it comes to something that people just naturally don't believe in, like fairies or unicorns or reptilian overlords or whatever it may be. You don't apply a special word to that, you know, an a-unicornist or an a-fairyist. Atheist is just without theism. Atheism, without a theistic belief. It is the absence of something. So to treat it as a faith or to treat it as a religion is nonsensical in the highest degree. That being said, it's also a categorical mistake to try to substitute the term agnostic where atheist is, because it might sound better or might seem simpler. Now, though, I don't think that anybody who's, again, intellectually honest can claim to be Gnostic about a God. There are people that will say that they know God doesn't exist or does exist, a Gnostic atheist or a Gnostic theist. And to both, you lose a lot of credibility, because you're now on the atheist side making the mistake of making a claim and thus needing proof. Whereas on the theist side, it doesn't really change the fact that they have the burden of proof, but it just highlights a further level of misunderstanding about what it is to truly know or not know something. Getting to a point made by John Anderson, though, it should be evident in and of itself that science doesn't have all the answers. Science is a tool with which we discover the answers to problems. So to assume that scientists or science thinks it has all the answers is to fundamentally misunderstand the process or what science actually is. Religion claims to have the ultimate word on what's happening in the universe. Regardless of its denomination or origins, they all claim to explain what's going on around you and to explain the mind of some deity or several, as there have been thousands of deities in Earth's history, most of which even believers are atheists to, except for this one, except for the current and most widely held belief of a single Christian God, or Yahweh, or Allah in Islam. There's a funny saying that I love to interject here from Richard Dawkins that, over time we've become atheists to many, many gods. I am just atheist to one more God than you. So, I don't know, a fun little play on how we think and how society has shifted and changed over millennia. But again, to assume that science has all the answers, or they don't make mistakes, or they like the stewards to all the information of the cosmos, is to fundamentally misunderstand what science is and how it is used to understand what's around us. Scientists love proving each other wrong, because with that, often an important discovery has been made. And it's thanks to the very extensive levels of peer review and cross-checking and wanting to prove wrong and verify and do the experiment that we make these profound discoveries that allow us to do the things we do today. One of the coolest of which being the fact that we've got the James Webb Space Telescope giving us information on our galaxy and universe around us that we couldn't have seen with Hubble and others, because we didn't have that level of infrared spectral analysis to actually look at the universe and look further back in time. And now, thanks to new studies on gravitational waves, we can probably see even further back than Webb can see. But I digress. The excitement of what's going on in space science is a whole other topic. Feel free to go crazy in the comments and ask all the questions.
There's a wonderful quote from the Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, who says outside his field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy.
That right there is probably one of the most important things he could have said in this video that went right over his head and John Anderson's head. Richard Feynman, another hero of mine and a brilliant mind in the field of science and a proponent of quantum electrodynamics. There's a fantastic book by Professor Lawrence Krauss called Quantum Man that I recommend everybody read if you're interested in quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, anything quantum. It is incredible. It took me a few times to understand some of the concepts when you start talking about spin 1/2 particles and false vacuum, and yeah, there's so much mind-blowing stuff in there. But back to what he just said, that outside of their field, they're just as dumb as the next person. This is in itself an example of humility of science, of the humble nature of being a scientist. Whenever we are speaking out of our field or depth or specialty, we hedge it with, I am not an expert in this, or I don't have the information in this, or said person is a better example or a better source for this, but, and then here's my idea, or whatever the case. As a science communicator, it's important to understand that as well. I am not an expert in any one field of science. I am a general lover of science and of the process and of understanding the world around me. And I love being able to share that excitement with people around me. I have learned ways to express scientific ideas in a way that can be a bit more easily digested than one might experience if they're just talking to professionals in a given field. But this is one of the biggest things that theists will get wrong. He quoted this right from Richard Feynman. that outside of his field, the scientist is as dumb as the next guy. When it comes to the fields of science and understanding the scientific method and what's being discovered around us, if you're going from a religious perspective or point of view, or you're trying to utilize the Bible to explain something, you are that person stepping way outside of their field, and in so showing that you are as dumb as the next guy. It has a sort of funny way of playing into the idea that, you know, to be Christian is to be so humble, meek, and mild, when in fact, most of the time, you know, these claims are to supersede science and bring all the credit of creation and discovery back to religion, and to think that our tiny planet in the backwoods of a regular galaxy amongst billions of galaxies in a massive cosmos is home to the one species that is chosen and loved by the creator of all things. I mean, I don't see much humility or humble nature in that.